additional fiscal deficit will probably rely on more external financing.
The aftermath will find us with a significant increase in public deficits and debt, and this is something that we should address. The idea here to have like a medium long-term fiscal plans, I think it will be necessary in many countries in order to provide an envelope, a credible envelope that allows the country to get money, to get financing, and to provide a credible commitment for investors that the macroeconomic situation, the deterioration in the macroeconomic situation is just transitory.
We should not infer from the fact that we have market access today that we will continue to have access tomorrow or next year. We know that the ability to roll over debt is exactly the first thing that vanishes in the event of a financial crisis.
My sense is that we have to be very cautious about the role of markets. Why? Because there are a lot of uncertainties in the global economy. As uncertainties grow in the global economy, there will be more flight to quality. Investors will prefer more safe assets. Also, the numbers in our region are going to come out very negative. That, of course, affects sentiments on the part of investors as well. So I don't think we should rely too much on this idea that the markets are going to be there to finance.
We also need to talk, and maybe we'll do a little bit later, what happens if there's no debt relief by China, which has also been an important partner for many countries.
A few countries may have reserves, and the reserves may help smooth the transition. And here Guillermo has written quite a lot in the past, and very insightfully so, about the need to use reserves. You know, we don't accumulate reserves simply to keep them there in a shelf.
I worked very hard a couple of years ago on making sure that the World Bank got additional capital. I'm glad we did that, but that's not enough.
Ultimately, the very big policy question for emerging markets in general, and for Latin America in particular, is how do we pay for that current account deficit?
We'll need to figure out ways in which we can build a bridge between the global liquidity, essentially generated by the central banks that issue reserve currencies, and the needs of our region. We have to build that bridge.
So the question of access from the IFIs, from the IMF, from the World Bank becomes crucial.
The first best solution will be to provide more capital to the MDBs. But we all know that that's a very complex process because it requires legislative action in countries like the US. It also brings a number of governance issues like voting rights. So it's very hard.
The World Bank, the IDB, the regional development banks have plenty of very good advice. They have some money, but in the big scheme of things, the money they have is not very much. The IMF has lending capacity of about $1 trillion by the fund's own recognition, but the fund estimates the overall financing needs of emerging markets in 2.5 billion. So the IMF is in a position to fund only 40% of what emerging markets need.
What I'm proposing is a solution that relies more on central banks, less on the executive branch of government, more on the central banks. The central banks of the advanced economies, they have the mandate. They should be worried about the global economy. They have the capacity to provide some of that liquidity, the QE, to transfer that liquidity into emerging economies through different mechanisms.
There's a lot of liquidity being created by the major central banks of the world, the Fed, the ECB, the Bank of England, the Bank of Japan. There are takers for that hard currency liquidity in the emerging market world. The question is, who plays intermediary? Why not set up a special purpose vehicle which could be run by the fund, or by the fund and the bank and the multilateral agencies and banks together, whose main purpose is basically to play an intermediary role and take that liquidity to the countries that need it. There are wrinkles in that scheme that need to be ironed out, but something like that is going to be absolutely key.
Inspired by the comments of Mauricio and Andres, having to do about the role of the World Bank in particular, because that's one of the things that it will be really very useful now, and probably it will become strictly necessary going a little bit forward because of the lack of finance?
This does not mean that markets are completely left out. Yes, we can still access markets, but markets need to de-risk. This special purpose vehicle would also play the role of reducing the risk, say introducing some credit enhancements to these loans that are being provided to emerging economies so that the markets develop an appetite again.
It may be necessary to also have some say on what emerging markets do with their debt. Otherwise, we know, I mean, there's a moral hazard or a political hazard, I don't know what name to give it.
I agree with Guillermo that if we circumvent markets and we go through the IFIs or MDBs, there's going to be a tension of doing more than what we can pay in the long term. And therefore, there has to be some monitoring here. And that's where I think the IMF plays a very important role.
That the institutions should also have some say on debt policy, the debt structure, etc., etc. That may be complicated, but if you don't do that, again, it can self-destroy very quickly, and also the countries that will be on the other side of the table may have a lot of hesitation.
We need a bigger international financial safety net where different institutions provide liquidity, but where the role of conditionality remains in the hands of the IMF. And I think that's the right way to think about it. I cannot imagine an SPV which suddenly has its own conditionality. I would feel perfectly okay if the SPV does the lending, but the other lenders, to some extent, at least on macro issues, subordinate their lending decisions to whether the IMF finds that the macro policy framework is okay or not. Some people may hate that for political reasons. I think that in the short run, there is no alternative.
We need this bridge. The IMF and the MDBs are in a unique position to promote that bridge because they need it. And that's what will give them, more capacity to lend to these countries and more influence on their policy making.